Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming, and many thanks for inviting me here, particularly to Amy and Patricia and to Chris Malinsky for not only inviting me but also inviting an exhibition which is upstairs of some of my recent projects and installing it so beautifully. As you will find out when I start speaking, that I have a lot of questions about exhibitions of art, so it was kind of a very unusual thing for me to agree to actually have an exhibition of something in an art museum. And so it was a very pleasant surprise to see it and to like it and to be happy that it's taking place. So, what I was thinking is that there will be maybe two parts to this talk tonight. One will be maybe a little bit more of a conceptual part, let's say, which I will read. It's something that I've been preparing for a while. It's based on a couple of other lectures that I did recently about two of maybe the more important projects that I've been involved in for the last 5 years. This lecture, also subversions of it, were published partially as text in various publications. For example, there's a really nice magazine in Texas called Art Prize. Despite the name, it's actually quite a serious publication on contemporary art, and I believe about a year ago they published a portion of this. So if some of you have read it, maybe it will sound a little bit familiar. And then I thought that if we have time left, we could do either two things. I could mention, I could say, just improvise a couple of words about the context for what I will be presenting, the specific projects, what made them possible. And we can also have like a conversation, a question-answer session, which maybe could be more interesting. But let me start now, and if I speak too fast, which I have a tendency to do, somebody please say something and slow me down. Yes. Chris, can I have the lights? Okay. So the talk is called, I think this is too dark. It's like a movie theater now. Let's have a little bit of light. Yeah, this is much nicer. So the talk is called Exhibition at School, Notes from United Nations Plaza. United Nations Plaza is Exhibition at School. I realize that this sounds somewhat paradoxical, yet it's the only way to describe a project that was originally intended as a biennial, Manifesto 6, scheduled to take place in Nicosia, Cyprus in the autumn of 2006. But instead, and after much turmoil, was realized as an independent temporary school in Berlin, and then later crossed the Atlantic to continue under the name Night School at the New Museum in New York City. Despite being an artist, I was invited to join the curatorial team developing the concept for Manifesto 6. Our thinking at the time was, why do another biennial? We felt that the incredible proliferation and homogeneity of such events have rendered them largely meaningless. Once offering an alternative to the conservatism of art museums, in more recent years, biennials had begun to resemble white elephant-type government projects, which drain local budgets for cultural production while offering rather formulaic digest of participation and content from the international contemporary art field. We decided instead to use the budget, resources, and network of the Art Biennial to start a temporary art school. There were several reasons why we were interested in the model of an art school rather than an exhibition of art. Perhaps a rehearsal of this rationale will shed some light on the possibilities of both exhibitions and art schools, and also art practice now and for the future. It is sufficient to give the titles of some recent large-scale international art exhibitions, for example, The Production of Cultural Difference, which was the title of the third Istanbul Biennial, or Critical Confrontation with the Present, which was the title of Documenta 10, to demonstrate that there is a strong desire on the part of the organizers and the participants to see their work as transformative social projects rather than merely symbolic artistic gestures. Such rhetoric and positioning has become the norm, and it now seems that artistic practice is automatically expected to play an active part as a transformative agent in a contemporary society. But is an exhibition, no matter how ambitious, the most effective vehicle for such engagement? In 1937, André Breton and Diego Rivera, and it is believed Leon Trotsky, wrote the manifesto called For an Independent Revolutionary Art. They called for a true art which is not content to play variations on ready-made models, but rather insist on expressing the inner needs of man and mankind in its time. True art is not able to not be revolutionary, not to inspire to a complete and radical reconstruction of society. What may appear to be a naive call for all or nothing revolution includes a subtle and important justification of that demand, that we as artists, curators, writers need to engage with society in order to create certain freedoms, to produce the conditions necessary for creative activity to take place at all. But what precisely does it mean that this desire that art and artists should engage with all aspects of social life? Is it merely a democratic impulse to open up the places of art, a desire to bring art out of rarefied and privileged spaces into more real contexts? Or is it a move towards the further instrumentalization of art practice by assigning to it a concrete social use value? Okay. Public exhibitions of art started at the time of the French Revolution. What actually happened was that the King of France was evicted from his home, the Louvre, and executed along with his queen. Shortly thereafter, a part of the palace, Salon Carré, was used for the first fully public exhibition of painting and sculpture by a contemporary artist of the time. And that's Louis XV, about to be executed. And that was the first truly public exhibition of art. I will make a few asides from this written text because I just realized that it's actually quite boring to read. It's not that there weren't it's not that there weren't exhibitions of painting or sculpture before. Actually, it was a kind of a part of the project of enlightenment, and they were in fact started by the very king who was beheaded by Louis XV in his palace in the Louvre, the back section. There was a kind of a union of Parisian painters at the time who held an annual exhibition. The only thing about accessibility or access to this exhibition, while it wasn't explicitly restricted, there was a stipulation that only people who had clean shoes could enter the exhibition. And of course, in Paris at that time, the only people who had clean shoes were the people that rode in carriages, not walked the streets, which automatically meant that only aristocracy and the upper class of the bourgeoisie and royalty could actually view the artwork in the space. So in a sense, after the revolution, this was the very first time that anybody, any citizen of this new republic, could come and together collectively, experience an exhibition of art. So the audience for the Salon show was, in a sense, the first real public, a group comprised of citizen subjects who have just violently gained political power and instituted the First Republic. The works in this exhibition did not contain any explicitly politically or socially engaged artworks, but rather traditional paintings of landscapes, nudes, mythological and religious motifs. Yet the actual experience of being able to enter the royal palace to view art was surely political, and it was intimately connected to the revolutionary process taking place at the time. Perhaps attending the exhibition of art was no different than voting or going to a public hospital or visiting a state ministry for the first time, experienced as an integral part of the new political agency that citizens experience, which allowed them to truly shape their communities and change them via political means. And this is another salon which is contemporaneous with this salon as an art exhibition, which is of course another sort of European institution of the time, a gathering of writers, intellectuals, scientists to discuss things, to a discursive salon. And for me, it was always very interesting how both of these social formations actually existed at the same time and were so incredibly important in terms of both developing a kind of a social space, civic space, but also advanced cultural ideas and notions of the time. So what is of real importance here is that the situation perhaps simultaneously created unprecedented positions and opportunities for both artistic practice and art institutions. For the first time, the presence of a public offered artists the potential to transform their community through art's critical function, to engage groups and influence public opinion, which in turn can and has resulted in tangible social and political change. It is in no way accidental that several decades later we see emergence of such figures as Courbet, Manet, and others who helped to institute the paradigm of critically engaged art practice that we're still following today. For art institutions, the move away from public collections and an emergence of art being public implies a transition to a much more meaningful social function. In this way, both the artist and the art institution suddenly managed to obtain a very sovereign position. Interestingly, this was possible through a process of mere spectatorship, looking at art objects and representations. However, there is a catch. The spectators of art have largely lost their political agency as such. As early as 1980s, American artist Martha Rosler observed that the public, in the sense of groups of engaged citizen subjects, was being replaced by audiences. The difference between those two terms, public and audience, is easily imagined if you think of a situation like an opera house or a cinema, in which audiences sit passively in a darkened room, rather than situations allowing people to participate in a more active way. And here is a couple of images of a very important show of Martha Rosler that took place in New York in the 80s, where she, it's called If You Lived Here, which was a cycle of 3 exhibitions that took place at the Dia Foundation. And this was happened when New York's East Side was being completely gentrified, and tens of thousands of people were being displaced. So the exhibition was on urban planning, homelessness, but it was not only an exhibition, it was a series of town hall meetings and all sorts of, let's say, discussion platforms for political activists, architects, people involved in various homeless rights organizations in New York, various other grassroots organizations in the Lower East Side, and artists as well. This was a part of that exhibition, and this was actually a reading room. Initially, she wanted the museum to, or the art space to actually give over a part of the space as a kind of a functional homeless shelter, but of course they got absolutely terrified by this idea, and the best she could do is actually create a kind of a temporary reading space where people could come. So I would say that arguably what Rosler had begun to observe in the 1980s about this kind of strange transformation of public into audience has by now become a fait accompli. And the important or difficult thing about that is that, in a sense, audiences are groups of consumers of leisure and spectacle. They have no political agency and no necessary means or particular interest in affecting social change. So while audiences for art have become enormous, it can be argued that there is no real public as such among them. Consequently, while it is still possible to produce a critical art object, there would seem to be no public that could complete its transformative function, rendering the very premise of critical contemporary art practically effectively unattainable, or at the very least severely reducing its agency. If the transformative function of art is what we're after, an exhibition may not be the best place to start. Perhaps the school as a model can point a way to recuperating the agency of art in the absence of an effective public. And these are a couple of other interesting projects from just before, let's say, from the 70s. There was an incredible American artist, Gordon Mata Clark, that also organized a very unusual project in New York. It was a restaurant which was called Food, which was a kind of a pay as what you wish kind of a situation in Soho. It was started in our neighborhood, which was formerly an industrial sort of center, which was vacated by the industry, and kind of artists started moving in there because there were a lot of inexpensive, large loft spaces. But it had absolutely no infrastructure, and importantly, no spaces to assemble. No cultural centers, no sort of places where groups of artists and curators and writers could come together and speak. So they opened in the storefront, they opened this kind of very informal restaurant, which became by default a kind of a cultural center that had no exhibitions, no formal sort of cultural event, yet informally it's substituted what a lot of art centers actually are supposed to do. Gosh, it's a bit confusing with the images and the text, but I'll try to manage. Art schools are one of the few places left where experimentation is to some extent encouraged, where emphasis is supposedly on process and learning rather than on product. Art schools are also multidisciplinary institutions by nature, where discourse, practice, and presentation can coexist without inevitably privileging one over the other. The actual activities that typically take place at an art school, experimentation, scholarship, research, discussion, criticism, collaboration, friendship, contribute to a continuous process of seeking out and redefining the potential in practice and theory. An art school is not concerned solely with the process of learning, but it can be and often is a super active side of cultural productions. books and magazines, exhibitions, new works, seminars and symposia, film screenings, concerts, performances, theater productions, new fashions and product designs, architectural projects, resources such as libraries and archives of all kinds, outreach and organization. These and many other activities and projects can be triggered there. However, unlike exhibitions, schools are most often closed to the public, with much of their programming and contents available only to the body of registered students. Furthermore, with their insistence on compliance with previously established rules and standards, educational institutions often ensure that for all their promise of experimentation and innovation, each successive generation of students evolves into a replica of the preceding generation, something which could arguably be bypassed if the school was made temporary. If the two models, temporary and publicly accessible exhibition, and potentially innovative and experimental but publicly restricted school were combined, perhaps a new, radically open school could provide a viable alternative to exhibitions of contemporary art and could reinstate the agency of art by creating and educating a new public. This, then, in outline, was some of the reasoning that led us to propose the substitution of a biennial exhibition by a temporary school. Initially, the proposal was met with much enthusiasm, both locally in Cyprus and internationally. The Manifesto School in Nicosia, and this is Nicosia, was intended to be structured into 3 departments, each semi-autonomous and deploying a different educational model, ranging from a largely online independent study program to a nomadic school with constantly shifting locations that would use existing spaces in the city, from movie theaters to bars. Nicosia is the capital of Cyprus, and is a divided city. The southern part is populated mainly by Greek Cypriots, while the north is largely Turkish Cypriot. Following the end of Cyprus's colonization by Great Britain and a period of bloody ethnic tensions between the two groups, including a failed military coup initiated by the military junta in Athens, Turkey moved its troops into the northern part of the island to protect ethnic Turkish Cypriots. The northern side then declared independence from the Republic of Cyprus in the early 1980s, and the two sides have been separated by a United Nations administered buffer zone, which runs throughout the center of the city. When we entered this complex political situation with our project, which was in 2004, there was much talk about the unification of the island, but it didn't come to pass. Manifesto 6, however, was to take place throughout the entire city and involve participation from both sides of the ethnic divide. My part of the project, which was Department 2, was to take place in an old hotel building in the Turkish Cypriot neighborhood, and that's actually the building. It was called Hotel Atlas, which would combine living quarters for participants with more public production presentation spaces. Several thousand artists, curators, filmmakers, musicians, architects, designers, and others from all parts of the world applied to take part in the school, and approximately 100 were selected to join the core group of the program and stay in Cyprus for the 100 days of the biennial. The school was intended to be free of charge, and selected participants were to be offered financial assistance and modest production budgets from the biennial's budget. This part of the program was to be situated in the Turkish side of the city, which in itself was not meant to be controversial. However, as we moved closer to the opening of the biennial, despite assurances and agreements made with local officials, the progress stalled. Demands were made that the entire project, the entire biennial, be situated solely in the Greek Cypriot side of the city. Naturally, we refused, as it was inconceivable to us that a whole community would be excluded from involvement in an international cultural event. And after numerous attempts to negotiate a solution, when it became clear that our efforts were being completely blocked, we spoke to the local press and were immediately dismissed by the Greek municipality that had commissioned the project. So the biennial was cancelled 3 months before the opening, and numerous lawsuits ensued, and any possibility of realizing this project under the auspices of Manifesta dissolved into thin air. For me, this was a very important point. The confrontation with Cypriot officials left everyone involved completely exhausted and demoralized. Furthermore, the mere threat of legal action scared away virtually all the international funding institutions and other partners. However, I was really reluctant to let go of this project without finding out whether an experimental exhibition at school would actually work. All of the artists and writers who I've been closely working with on developing this idea, who are Boris Groys, Martha Rosler, Liam Gillick, Walid Rad, Jalal Tawfiq, Nicholas Hirsch, and Tirdad Zelgadar, were equally curious, and so after some discussion, we decided to attempt realizing this project independently as a self-organized initiative in Berlin. I have found it increasingly important to find ways of doing things that do not involve complete reliance on existing institutions for audience funding or legitimacy. It is not at all coincidental that many of the most important art schools, such as the Bauhaus and the Black Mountain College, were self-organized by groups of artists. Sometimes I feel that it's almost impossible to realize truly innovative idea within a framework of already established institutions and their networks, which is what an international biennial actually is. Some people have pointed out to me that even if Manifesto 6 had not been censored by the local officials, the experimental nature of the project could well have led to the last-minute opposition from the contemporary art market and establishment. After all, there are very specific expectations for what an international art show should offer, not least the spectacle of national representation and new commodities for the market, neither of which would have been offered by our school. So if we're interested in the kind of art projects that are not merely variations on ready-made models, it is urgent to think of situations in which the work can exist and circulate on its own, framed in a sense by itself. After half a century of isolation and division, Berlin was a particularly interesting location for our school in exile. After the fall of the wall, many artists from Germany and Europe settled in the eastern part of the city. This huge migration of cultural producers moved and organized much faster than the development of any official art institutions. The result has been an incredible proliferation of self-organized exhibition spaces, collective venues, and small independent institutions which have dominated the cultural landscape of Berlin for nearly 2 decades now. In effect, the self-organized projects enjoy the same and sometimes even greater degree of cultural legitimacy than the official institutional culture of that city. I came to Berlin and quickly found a small building on United Nations Plaza, a place formerly called Leninplatz, in the city's eastern section. To avoid additional legal problems of Cyprus and to reflect on the radical transformation of the project, we decided to name the school after the address of the building, United Nations Plaza. The structure of the project was very simple: a free and formal series of seminars, conferences, lectures, film screenings, and occasional performances. The focus was on contemporary art. The length of the project was 1 year. It was open to all who came, and it publicized its content through publications, a radio station, and online dissemination. The project also operated Salon Allemand, a functioning bar in the basement of the building put together by several of the artists involved in the project and open for business sporadically. The program was duration-based, which is to say that it was meaningless to come to the school only once. Repeated visits were necessary to gain any value from the discussion. For unlike a normal artist talk or lecture, the seminars were lengthy. Sometimes they stretched for several weeks, bringing people together every night, including weekends. In total, there were 6 of the seminars throughout the year. The topics ranged from the role of religion in post-communist condition, to the history of video art as a social medium, to the viability of discursive frame, or the possibility of art in the context of war, and from the production of images in a post-Enlightenment era to many other themes. United Nations Plaza also presented various film screenings and performances, hosted Martha Rosler Library during the summer months, and produced a film entitled A Crime Against Art, based on an unusual conference was staged in Madrid in the form of a trial. Importantly, United Nations Plaza functioned very much as an artwork in its own setting, an art project that did not need anyone to display it or to promote it or to bring audiences to it. It did all of that for itself. Furthermore, United Nations Plaza demonstrated that this mode of practice can travel as it did from New York and Mexico City, that this mode of critical practice can also engage effectively and integrally with an institution, as this particular project did with the new museum in the form of the night school, yet it does not completely depend on the institutions to manifest itself. Of course, United Nations Plaza is not a unique project, example of such practice. It fits within a tradition of extra-institutional projects from Gordon Murray Clark's Food, slides of which I showed to you earlier, to more recent projects such as the Land Foundation in Chiang Mai, Thailand, which is something organized by an artist recruiter, Vania. Inevitably, the program of United Nations Plaza demanded a lot of time from the audience. And even more importantly, it forced some members of the audience to articulate their position in relation to this project. Reciprocally, it offered all those who attended a stake in the project, a certain kind of ownership situation in that everyone who came could participate to the degree that they wished. I would argue that this enabled the kind of productive engagement that is still possible if spectatorship is bypassed and the traditional roles of institution, curator, artist, public are encouraged to take on a more hybrid complexity. For me, this means that given some changes to how art experience is conceived and constructed, the idea of the public can be resurrected and the modality of critical art practice can be preserved. So this is the end of part one. Maybe we should turn on the lights a little bit. So now, guys, you have an option of how would you like to proceed. We could actually have a conversation. I can answer questions. I could talk a little bit about the background of what made United Nations Plaza possible, because of course, it's not that simple that a biennial gets cancelled, and you do a gigantic project with hundreds and hundreds of artists from all over the world, independently, without any funding, so what should we do? Should I talk a little bit more contextually about, yeah, okay. So the reason why it was possible is because 10 years ago I started a kind of a project called eFlux. The beauty of eFlux is still after 10 years, I really don't have a very clear way to describe what it is, which is a very good thing because that's how it stays interesting. It kind of doesn't fit into any criteria. It has many different aspects, and one, it started in a very humble way as a kind of a mailing list about exhibitions in New York to a tiny, tiny group of friends, other artists and curators. What happened was me and a couple of friends of mine who were unemployed curators at the time decided to organize a one-night exhibition in Chinatown. And we had a total budget of $260, which was enough to rent a suite for one night. But not a penny more, not to print invitations, not to make posters, not to even mail press releases. And at the time I had my first email account, and I was just exploring email, and I thought, well, maybe we could just try to email this press release to some friends, and something really remarkable happened. The exhibition had very strange hours because of the hotel situation, right? It started quite late. It started, I think, at 9 at night, and it went all through the night till 9 in the morning. And it was incredible how many people came during such strange hours. I think we may have had somewhere between 400 and 500 visitors. Of course, with a hotel, that's very kind of strange because we were terrified that they would actually kick us out or like what's going on. So we lied to them. We told them, in New York, like movie industry has a lot of power. If you say that you're shooting a movie, you can basically do anything. So we told them that we're auditioning for a film, and the film is about the art world. There will be a lot of people that will come throughout the night. The director is a very eccentric Japanese director. And it was around the time there was a very popular movie by John Waters called Pecker, which is a fantastic film. Now it was still playing in a theater, so we told them it's like Pecker but better. So, and amazing, it worked, like nobody bothered us but of course it didn't work completely because in the end at 9 o'clock in the morning, the people that work at the desk, came because they wanted to be auditioned for this film. So we were discovered, but it was fine. But, the next day I thought that this was really kind of incredible what happened by way of dissemination of information, that how is it possible that we send emails to 30, 40 people, and 400 people show up. So, besides it was completely free because, internet was free. So I thought that, wow, this is something really incredible. Maybe I should try to develop this into a resource that other, independent curators, artists, artist-run organizations could use, or anybody who faces this dilemma of doing a project and not being able to really publicize it or make others know that it's taking place. And this is precisely what I did, and I started something called eFlux, which is a new service And now, 10 years later, it's of course evolved into something quite vast. It works with close to, more than 1,000 museums and biennials and art publications and book publishers all around the world. And it's quite busy daily digest of information about exhibitions, symposia, publications, etc., etc. But then, at a certain point, and eFlux is not a non-for-profit, it's actually a commercial company. It's completely self-sufficient. It doesn't apply for government funding or anything like that. It generates revenue, and it actually generates income. And after paying ourselves, the group of people that actually work there, we're able to have surplus money that we invest in art projects. So we were able to, the reason why we were able to sort of bypass this whole Cyprus fiasco and actually complete it was that there was basically funding coming from eFlux, and the entire thing kind of mutated into an eFlux project. eFlux projects themselves started pretty shortly after I started the company itself. I think by 2000 or 2001, it was quite clear that the readership, which became really gigantic, it kind of snowballed, and from 20 people, it became 200 people, 2,000 people, 20,000 people. Now it's close to 60,000 people that actually read this information every day. But they were actually sending, because in the early days of email, it was kind of a very personal thing to get an email. And sometimes people actually, a lot of people replied as though they didn't fully understand that this is sent to everybody, not just to them. But there was in these replies, which I read with much curiosity, there was a kind of a desire, like they were curious about us, not only that we forward or we disseminate a press release for exhibition at MoMA, but they were really curious, like, well, what do we do? What do we think? So to kind of address this interest, we started a program of online projects, because also at that time, there was a lot of fascination with the possibilities of art and the internet. And, unfortunately for me, what was happening was really very disappointing, because it wasn't so much about art, it was all about internet, So I wanted to try to re-articulate this platform and really use internet as a dissemination mechanism for significant art or art that I find engaging or interesting, and not the other way around. So one of the first really important projects that we did was an exhibition that was organized in the early 90s by a Swiss curator who's very, very famous. His name is Hans-Ulrich Obrist. And the exhibition is called Do It, and it's something really remarkable. It's a compilation of art projects that circulate as instructions. For example, this is a work by late Felix Gonzalez Torres, which is an instruction. So this work has been shown at the Guggenheim, right? And on the auction, you could buy it for, I don't know how much, $200,000. But you could also just go to your local candy store, buy this candy and put it in the corner, and you have an authentic work by Felix Gonzalez Torres. So we basically put all of these instructions online, and some of them are quite lengthy. This is a very short one, because they're really, the range of imagination of 140 artists that participated in this project from all parts of the world is really enormous. And actually a lot of people did materialize them, because we asked them to, if they do make this work, please send us pictures, because we would like to see what it looks like. And 3 or 4 people actually made this piece, and it's very interesting to see. It's almost like music, you have a musical score, but of course each musician performs it slightly different, So, and it's fascinating to see these variations of how an idea materializes differently in different contexts. And then after that, we did another online project, which was called The Next Document. That should be curated by an artist, which is something organized by Jens Hoffmann, who is a German curator who now works in San Francisco, I believe at CCA. And it took place during the Documenta that I believe Okwuemezor curated in 2001. And Documenta is perhaps the most important art exhibition on the planet. I'm sure some of you know about it, but this is not only art audience here, so I maybe need to clarify a little bit. It's a show that takes place in Germany in a city called Kassel, and it was started after World War II as a kind of an attempt to reinvent or, make culture viable in Germany again. Because of course, after Holocaust and after that, and after Adorno's famous statement about the possibility of poetry after Holocaust, it was very, very difficult for German art institutions to even conceive of a, function after that calamity. So Documenta was really kind of a vast effort, you know, on governmental scale to really, I mean, the show has a budget of close to $30 million. It takes place once every 4 years, and it's really quite an important cultural event in this particular field. And we were talking with Jens Hoffman, and you know, we were thinking about that art field is so, like, visual art is so funny in the sense that, let's say in architecture, architects are kind of, quite often they work as curators of architecture, critics of architecture. An architect could run a museum, could write a book on architecture without ceasing to be an architect. And somehow in visual art, if you're an artist, there is such a strict division of labor that you're very discouraged to become a curator or to work as a curator, to work as a critic. You will never be able to, you know, sort of run or become the artistic director of a project like Documenta. Somehow, like, everything is really partitioned. The artists are supposed to be in their studios, you know, other professionals take care of, you know. And so we decided to do a kind of an online project where we invited 30 artists to present a proposal for a Documenta. Like, if they were the director of this exhibition, what would they do? And for me, this was also a quintessential project because it really made me rethink, you know, my activity as an artist, or the kind of sort of what I was expecting, or in which direction did I want to go. And of course, ironically, then I was invited to curate Manifesto, which is, I guess, the third, in Europe, like the third most important show. So things after this project actually started changing, and then another artist was invited to curate Berlin Biennial around the same time. So it's something that actually, even though it was very funny and whimsical and was so ephemeral just online, but it actually had a very strong effect in terms of how very big institutions perceived all of this kind of structures. Yeah. And we also published this next Documenta as a book, which was circulating, and you know, many other things. So that's basically Efflux, and we're based in New York. We're located on the Lower East Side in the storefront. And all of you are welcome to come by if you're visiting New York. It's 41 Essex Street. And basically what we do is, besides this news service and this kinds of art projects, we also organize exhibitions, and a lot of them travel all over the world. In fact, actually most of them, we use our space as a kind of a laboratory to develop ideas, which then somehow, inevitably, we're invited by other institutions to present them somewhere else. This, for example, is Martha Raza Library, a project that I initiated with Martha, who has an incredibly large book collection. And you know, I recently visited Donald Judd's house in Marfa, Texas, which is a very kind of famous place. And Judd was also, besides being a sculptor, he was an art critic, and he collected books and had a tremendous library, maybe 30,000 volumes. But there was something very strange that the estate, his family, and whoever preserves it, made a stipulation that you cannot move the books, or you cannot move anything in that house even a millimeter from where it's located on the day he died. So the entire place is completely frozen. And with objects, like, I don't really mind, whatever, but with books it's very strange because you can't open them. And even people that are researching his work and writing about him are not able to open the books, and some of them are still in the plastic sleeve, so they're actually getting destroyed because, you know, the state says that you cannot remove the plastic. So it's like a kind of a catch-22, and I thought, well, can you even call it a library at that point? Is it just an accumulation of some objects, you know? And with Martha, so I was telling her the story. She says, oh, and I have a lot of books too. In fact, you know, my house is so small, they're everywhere, like I can't walk anymore. And just as a joke, I said, Martha, do you think we could borrow them for a little while and open a small public library reading room in our office? And she said, okay, but I didn't believe her because she's been collecting this book since 1967, you know, and it's something so private in a way, you know, your book collection, like, why, how can we, but I kind of asked her again a couple of weeks later, and she said, yeah, sure, let's do it. And so we did, we removed all of the books from her house. It's precisely 8,960 somewhat volumes, and brought it into our tiny space which we had at the time, which was really like the size of the toilet on this floor. And then somehow a lot of museums found it a very interesting idea, so this project traveled to Europe and has been sort of traveling now for 3 years. This is this project in Germany, this is in Paris, I believe, and And now we're actually ending it just because from so much usage, some of the books are getting destroyed. So I want to return it to her house because otherwise I would just feel really kind of criminal. And so the last installment of it will be in Massachusetts at Elmhurst in the University Gallery. And that opens next month. Another project we did recently is called Pawn Shop, which is exactly what it says. At the beginning of the recession, we were actually, before it was announced, we already felt that something is really wrong. And we decided to, partly as a joke, but partly as a kind of maybe an attempt to understand, what happens with art economically, because, contemporary art and modern art, the whole premise behind it is it's supposed to be experimental, it's supposed to be innovative, it's supposed to, and there is such a range of invention within artistic practices, but in a more sort of institutional way, and particularly when it comes to like the commerce of art, these systems haven't changed in hundreds of years. There is only like the auction, like the Sotheby's or Christie's, or there is a gallery, an art gallery. And it's so strange that in 200 years of modern and contemporary art, nothing else has been invented by way of how do you circulate these objects economically, So we thought, well, maybe a pawn shop is a really interesting idea, because there is, it's funny, but there is something very beautiful, which is this strange moment of limbo, because when you pawn something for 30 days, usually, the pawn shop is not able to sell it. No, they have to wait because maybe you come back. And in that moment, the object, it doesn't really have a value assigned to it. It exists solely for display, for its aesthetic or something, yeah? And this moment is so interesting because that's precisely, it's almost like a choreography of art and money. And so, and we invited some artists, but it was really open, like artists would come and pawn a work of art, and of course we didn't do it for money, although we could have really sold everything. People were quite interested. Yeah, maybe, let's see, is there anything else? There's some pictures. Maybe I just mentioned Iflux Journal because that's something, maybe the outcome of United Nations Plaza and Night School, which both of these kind of projects ended now, what they evolved in is a journal. And tomorrow I go to Toronto. This art center invited me to. They're having a panel about publishing in digital age, because a lot of art publications are very nervous right now. They can't sustain themselves economically. Print publications are really having a gigantic crisis. So people are trying to think, or at least imagine, what will they be like in the future. And so they invited me to talk because last year we started a journal, mainly online on our site, which is called Iflux Journal, and it's a monthly, it's a really incredibly crazy project that we're doing because it's so much work to publish a serious monthly periodical on contemporary art. It's mainly critical theory, there are no exhibition reviews, there's no gossip columns, just really kind of quite serious text. And it's popular, it has a really big readership. I think by now we have between 8,000 to 10,000 readers per issue, which, with an art community, these are gigantic numbers because it's such a, in a way, small audience sometimes. So they see it as a very successful example, and they want me to talk about the internet. They think it has to do with cookies or some kind of targeted mailing list of graphics. So I have to go there because I have to tell them that it has nothing to do with it. It really has much more to do with all of the school projects and creating a kind of a circle of incredible contributors who are artists and writers and curators that have these ideas that express themselves sometimes in form of text, but also being aware that there is such an interest in this knowledge, that there is such a demand for this knowledge. And for me, let's say publishing or doing it, online on our site, but also in print, is a way to really broaden the school and make it something closer to a kind of a universal station where people who can't afford to travel to Berlin or New York or could still participate, could still gain access to the content of this. And so that's, let's say, basically what an online version of it looks like. We also came up with this. We're still finalizing it, but it's a print-on-demand system, kind of a very beautiful software program that somebody wrote for us that enables us that the moment we upload the content online, it immediately generates a PDF that can be printed in any different way of printing. It could be offset, It could be just on a Xerox printer, it could be on a computer printer. You could make it for yourself, or you could actually become a publisher and produce a number of copies and disseminate them in your community. You could include your own advertisement and fund your production by, if you can, if you want. So it has like this, all of these possibilities, and we're just about to make it public. I think we're still finalizing the technicalities of it, but I think in the next month or two, this print on demand, free print on demand system will go online. And then also, once a year we'll publish a book, like a reader, which is a selection of essays from the previous year, and they're not necessarily the best of Iflex Journal, but they're selected to represent certain thematic threads within kind of ideas that have been expressed in the publication. So I think that's probably enough of me talking solo, but maybe if you have questions, I would be delighted to answer them.
As far as the exhibition here at KMA, I guess it's a two-part question. Do you see it as, did you pick from some of your projects, or the big breadth of projects that you work on, to show an example of what you do, or was there a decision to have these things work together? How did you decide what to show in this space here, and as it functions together?
The show here actually came, I actually managed to avoid having exhibitions of this kind of exhibitions for about 5 years. I mean, for me, it was almost like some kind of a marathon. How long can I go without an exhibition of art objects and remain an artist? And finally, so I'm a little bit ambivalent about doing this in the end, but I think it's kind of okay. What happened was I had a really amazing intern in Berlin, this young artist from Portugal who, with her friends, they kind of got a grant in Lisbon to run temporarily a small art center for 6 months and to do a series of exhibitions. And she asked me if I could do something, and for some reason, like, I couldn't say no to her, maybe because she was an intern or something like that. And so I said, okay, and then together we kind of developed, let's show this, let's show that, and then the work was actually produced for it. But the idea, I think that one of the reasons why I agreed is because nobody would have ever seen that, because Lisbon is like the edge of Europe that has almost no like sort of art scene, and it's so incredibly obscure there that it was kind of safe, right? But then somehow Chris invited me to bring it here, and I thought, well, I have to do the stop. Maybe it's good as a kind of a, whatever, like a show and tell kind of thing, and I talk about it here. You could go upstairs and look at some objects. Maybe that's not a bad idea, but I'm still not fully convinced that this was a good thing. Yes.
I'd like to pick up on the idea of the school as, your criticism of school as an institution, as opposed to one that's essentially homegrown, bottom-up, in terms of the international plaza and so forth. As someone who's taught in university for over a quarter century, I would agree completely with you if, in the institutional context of an art school, you regard the students as one of the important changing elements that change the dynamic.
So then you have to give them power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying, that can happen in the institutional context when you give the students power. And so you
it has happened, absolutely, like in Free University in Berlin, even at Columbia at some point. But I think there's been quite, a reversal of this way, I'm not a scholar of, art and educational institutions in their history, but to me it seems that there was a kind of a retrenchment, a little bit, or a step back from empowerment of students. Would you agree, or just across the board? Not only in the States but also in Europe. Like in Berlin right now, there was a huge issue with the art academy where almost the entire student body really wanted a professor that was teaching there to be hired full time, and the school itself felt that they wanted to hire somebody else who is more famous and more prestigious name to have on their roster, who has never taught, who is not really like this person that they wanted to hire was a photographer, but this was for a video department, but he's never made any video or film. So it was just really kind of, and the students tried to do a demonstration, and there were all sorts of meetings and stuff, but they couldn't, the school was too strong, and or it never radicalized to such an extent that, you know, that they could actually tell the school, no, 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 we want this professor, we don't want that professor, you know.
I've taught in Poland for a semester, and I'm aware of the cultural differences, and I think actually a lot of American students in art schools are often more empowered than their peers in Europe in a variety
Well,
of
that's because a
different
lot of times they feel that they're the customers.
I think that's
Because they pay for it.
that is one piece of it, but the problem, of course, is they're regarded as customers. It completely pollutes their
Yeah, it's
powers
terrible. It's
as
terrible,
artistic, creative,
Yeah.
in a gift economy.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
I agree completely with you, but I think that in institutional context, you can create systems that empower the students.
No, I think you can, and we all should, you know. I don't really teach in institutions. I mean, for me, yeah, I don't even like teaching. You know, I like this kinds of projects, but, you know, but I think people that do work, and there are a lot of artists that are really committed to education. And so, I mean, it's a very traditional thing for an artist is to teach, because that's kind of the only way that they could, you know, steadily support themselves, because the art market is always so unstable and volatile. So everybody that I work with actually on these projects, they all teach somewhere, you know. Even people that don't need the money, like Liam Gillick, for example, he really doesn't need to do this, but he's so dedicated to teaching, you know, and to his students. So, you know, so I think they try, you know. Okay, sure.
Start question. I'm thinking about your comments about Black Mountain College,
Mhm.
which is sort of an interest of mine. So there were Black Mountain College had two sites. One was temporary; it was the rented site, and they had to pack up every year and unpack. And then the lease fell through there at Blue Ridge, and they bought land and built the
Right.
site, fired the president, and the place collapsed in about 15 years. And I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit about sort of real estate in the art world and some of these ideas that you're
Well,
talking
it's all about
when
real
it
estate.
comes to- right. And there are interesting temporary educational situations. I'm thinking about John Cage at the New School.
You know, the thing is that it makes me think of something maybe a little bit important, like there is this idea that it seems to be all about real estate, right? that some space needs to be created. We always talk about some kind of production of space, you know, and I think a lot of times we mean it very literally, like real estate, you know, right? But then I think that, you know, the problem is not, space is all there, you know, but the problem seems to be the time, you know, that it's time that needs to be produced, or time needs to be reclaimed, or when people talk about, you know, like it kind of reminds me of the 68 generation, for example, that the idea is to occupy the factory, you know, and then you feel kind of empowered, right? But then you're occupied, and what do? I mean, you continue working, or what, you know? So, like, I wish it was possible somehow to occupy time, you know, which maybe like temporality or temporary projects, you know, it's something that I haven't really like thought through yet. It's just as you're saying it, it reminds me of some very incoherent thoughts. But you know, maybe it's not so much at the end about space, but really like reclaiming your own time. You know.
Andrew Rice said that's why that was the end of Black Mountain College when he bought land, right? That the process of packing up and unpacking gave everyone a focus, and I think time is important.
But it's also like there's also a duration of any experimental institution, you know. I mean, how long does it stay, you know? And, you know, maybe then it needs to change significantly, but as if it already established itself as an institution, it becomes so difficult to change, almost impossible. So. But there was another question back there.
Yeah, I was just curious about the public that came to the school. So the idea of creating a school as a public space in terms of public being invested in this idea of citizenship or state.
Well, it's not it's having a stake in the situation.
It
It started in the beginning with mainly artists and like curators, and there were three instances of this project. One was in Berlin, one was in New York, and one was in Mexico City, and each one was quite different. Because in Berlin, we had our own building, and it was up for a whole year. It was completely free, and so the demographic of the people that were coming changed slowly. In the beginning, it was mainly artists, and then there were people started coming from local universities, because like in Berlin, for example, media studies departments are very strong and very large, and it's a kind of it doesn't mean what it means in the States. Like media studies, also media theory, critical theory, it's all overlapped. So a lot of these people started coming to us, but also people from architecture schools, architects as well. So towards the end of the project, it was really completely interdisciplinary audience, which was kind of amazing. But it took a year to develop this,
Did anyone come who wasn't invested in creative production?
Yeah, once. It was kind of amazing because it was my first instance of meeting the member of this enlightened bourgeoisie that I heard about so much but never quite encountered. We did a very unusual lecture by a French philosopher who is a scholar of Hegel. His name is Joseph Cohen. And because Hegel lived and died in Berlin, and he's buried in a cemetery near Chausseestrasse, and it's a very, very beautiful cemetery. And I had this kind of crazy idea to invite Joseph to do a lecture on Hegel at his grave on Sunday. And Joseph kind of agreed, and I don't know, maybe about 50 or 60 people came to this lecture. And maybe because of Hegel and because of the cemetery, which is quite famous in Berlin, it was listed in a lot of like local listings that had nothing to do with art. So this one gentleman showed up, and then he kind of joined us for lunch. We didn't know who he was, and then he paid for everybody, which is very sweet. And I started talking with him a little bit, and he's not an artist, doesn't go to museums. His brother is a aspiring philosopher or something like that, so he's interested in philosophy, and he came, and yeah, that was that. But it was really, really nice. Kind of a singular occurrence. But, in New York, of course, it was mainly people from the art world because it's in the museum, so it's either art historians or art critics, and which sometimes becomes, feels a little bit limited. You would want to open it up, but it's not so simple. Yes.
Would you speak to your experience in Mexico City, where and how that worked?
Yeah, in Mexico City it was really, I love working in Mexico City. I've been working there for 10 years. Almost every year I go there for one reason or another. Either it's a lecture like this or a seminar or to make a film or whatever. So it's actually one of the most inspirational places for me on this continent. And I was invited by a kind of a civic organization called Patronage of Contemporary Art, which is a really interesting organization. Around 10 years ago, it was formed because a number of people that worked at museums decided that maybe there were too many exhibitions and not enough critical discussions about art in Mexico City. So they formed a kind of institution without a space to organize a yearly kind of gigantic symposium, which is called CITAC, which is an acronym. I don't really know what it stands for, but it's a very big conference, and really thousands of people from all over Mexico come to it. And then they decided that just doing one yearly conference is not really enough, that they should do also a couple of other projects throughout the year that maybe are not so gigantic, maybe they're smaller in scale, but that would create more continuity in their programming. So they invited me to bring a kind of a small version of United Nations Plaza to Mexico City. They didn't have such a gigantic budget, so it wasn't possible to really do it for a year, but so it was a month-long, 30-day program, but it was 30-day every day, twice a day. Yes, so it was really intense, and we were given a very beautiful building. It's again a kind of a civic nonprofit organization. It was started by the municipality of Mexico City to give shelter to persecuted writers and poets in 1960s initially from Latin America, but I think it's called Casa Refugio. And they work actually mainly with literature and poetry. So for them it was, but of course, like, there is a bit of a problem because they have a very specific following in Mexico City, and they're running into the problem of age, that their audience is basically dying because they're so old. They're old in their 70s and 80s. So they were curious to engage with contemporary art as a way of finding another audience that would sort of continue coming to their institution and perhaps would become interested in literature and poetry and come to those events as well. So they invited us, and it was very nice. The only difficult thing is, of course, this entire program is in English, and in Berlin it was okay, although there was a bit of tension, that some people felt like, well, it's in Berlin, why is it in English, But it was kind of fine technically. In Mexico it was harder because people that speak English usually come from a very specific social class. So it immediately limits, the kind of accessibility of this to a very particular group of people, which, but at the same time, it was just financially not possible to have simultaneous translation for every, we tried with a few lectures, but for 30 days, twice a day, it would have been kind of unfeasible. So, yes.
But you continue to go even outside of this particular
Yeah. No, I've been exhibiting there, and when I used to exhibit, and I have many relationships with artists and writers and stuff like that. So, yes.
What thoughts do you have on how much time people actually spend in spaces like the reading rooms and the night school?
Well, I always, like one of my hesitations or reservations about universities and schools is that you're always dealing with kind of a trapped audience or trapped, like people have to stay for the whole class, or right? And there is some kind of punitive mechanism that ensures that they do, and if they don't, then there are consequences, no? So, what I really like about exhibitions of art is that kind of freedom that you can come in and out and stay as little or as long as you want. Of course, it's very frustrating